teach on our BA programs and on our other programs for teachers who are already finished but have to learn more. That's called the PD programs. My topic today is, as Jesper told you, some theory about a new understanding of society, which in the USA and England and in Denmark is called the competitive state. I've been working on this subject for some years, since a Danish professor called Ove Kaj Pedersen published this book, which was the result of 5 years of studies of international policy and economics. And he describes and analyzes the competitive state in a Danish context. And his main interest is politics and economy. And what I've been working on is the more pedagogical and also subjects concerning social work and more cultural aspects of this phenomenon. So I will try to make it understandable for you. I have to warn you, the first part is a bit boring, I know, but and more theoretical, but later on, the last half is going to get really funny, and you will laugh your way through. So if it's boring in the beginning, have faith in me, okay? First, some introduction, so we all are in the same mindset. In Denmark, and my main objective is the Danish context, but the theory is global. These changes are actually we can see them in most European countries, and I hope in the last part of our time together that you can pinpoint some developments in Serbia as well. They should be there, but let's see. But my study is mainly on the Nordic pedagogy and social work. And one of the things that are very clear in Denmark, as Jesper also introduced, that we are moving from teaching to learning. In Denmark, we focus on our new legislation on the teacher education on competences. It's not the matter or the subject that's important, it's the competences. And in Sweden, our neighbor country, they also reformed their teacher education. And in all the subjects that they had to teach, when the working groups described what should the students learn, they were disallowed to use the word teaching. They could not say the word teaching in teacher education. They had to say learning. That's a simple. The words are changing, and there's a reason for that. A Dutch professor called Geert Wester has written a lot about this subject internationally. This move from teaching to learning. In social work and in the children care, there is a move from being to performing. Earlier in the Danish early social work, we had a lot of focus on being. How would the citizen, what would they like to do with their life? How were they feeling? How were their physical health and their mental health? A widely focus on being, and the legislation we had on it when the social worker had to talk with the citizens, there was this focus on being. How were their whole life situation? Many people in Denmark were offered some programs actually focus on making their family work, so they felt right. Today we have another focus, and that's more on performing, both in social work and the early children care. What can they learn? What can they do? How can they get a job? How can they get an education? The focus is much more narrow on these matters. That's a general move also. And one of the dilemmas we're gonna discuss later on is there also a move from freedom to adaptation? When we teach, for example, we have a subject, a work of art, some interesting mathematics, something that we are talking about, you, me, and the subject. When we talk about learning, we focus on what's going on inside your heads. A change, you are changing. That's a big difference. When we focus on performing and not being, it's also a learning process. So we can discuss, I'm not sure, but it's possible to discuss whether this idea, these changes in legislation and in words, also is a move from the idea of individual freedom to adaptation to the state's needs. That's some of the subjects that I will talk about.
And those are actually also interesting suggestions for balances to be adjusted, I guess, when you look at curriculum development.
Of course. Very shortly, most of you have studied science a lot, but a brief historical view, because some of the theoretical background for these changes, in my opinion, and not only in my, but I've studied this too, and it has a lot to do, especially in pedagogy, with the postmodern theories of science, which ask the questions: what can be explained, and when and how is an explanation meaningful? And we have these different moves through history, from the early Enlightenment, where we had the idea of being able to explain something, find proof, find evidence, which was discussed, to in Denmark, especially around the 60s, we had this postmodern wave of science, especially social constructivism, post-structuralism. I cannot pronounce that in English. Post-structuralism. There it was. Great. Which debated the traditional theories and had a showdown with this idea of right or wrong, or proof or not proven. And in Denmark, in pedagogy, we have this reformed pedagogy inspired by John Dewey, also, which was based on learning. So we had this double movement, that there was no truth, and we had the individual to learn for themselves what to do and how to perform. And some of the theories Jes was presented earlier today is actually inspired by this post-structuralism in some sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Can I just add a comment? Because the model that I showed you with the 3 circles, remember? They're built on the assumption that there is no one identity possible. There is no stable identity anymore. Everything is postmodern, everything is fluid, liquid. Yeah. You have to reinvent your identity over and over again. That's the assumption that is underlying this model. When that is so, then the whole idea of, what was I getting at?
There's no truth. There's no truth.
There's no truth.
We don't have to search for any truth.
And it becomes that becomes very important for social work, because social work has to acknowledge all truths. That's what I mean. We have to be able to create room for everybody finding their own truth and refinding it tomorrow and refinding it the day after, having another one in another context. So that's important for social work. How to make room for that kind of multi-identity, multi-different
people
reality.
And how to navigate in it.
Yeah.
In my field, and it's actually the same in our tradition for social work, but in my field of pedagogy, in Denmark until 1975 at least, we had a very, very strong influence from especially the Kantian philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and also the pedagogy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Enlightenment philosophers. which were actually based on the idea of logic, that you could determine whether a saying was true or false. But also the idea that in human life, with a rational human who makes his own choice, you cannot define whether the future is right or wrong, because the future is held by a sovereign person. But especially the Kantian moral philosophy is a system that gives us the ability to define whether an action is right or wrong. And that has been a very strong core of the Danish pedagogy traditionally. And we have increasingly left that idea, because, as Jesper says, today we more and more believe that there is actually no right or wrong. There's a lot of discussion and a lot of meetings we had to do, a lot of dilemmas we had to handle, but there is no actually proof of the right and wrong.
Multiple truths.
Yeah, multiple truth is a better phrase. Yeah, and that's actually the state of the pedagogy today, and that's why we focus on competences, not being able to learn the children to do right or wrong, because we don't know what's right or wrong.
No, I mean, how can we have a model of how to raise a child? I mean, there is no one model. This is how to, or this is the end goal. This is the good way of raising a child, the children.
Yes. So that's the historical move in the Nordic countries, especially, and of course there is everything is coexisting. Like in Serbia, you have a tradition, and sometimes you have left the tradition, but everything is still a part of you. And it's also the same in Denmark. We have some leftovers from the old ideas, but there is clearly a change going on, as Jesper explained earlier. So the core words here is this loss of shared narratives, and that is, of course, a phrase I borrowed from Lyotard, who published his book on the postmodern condition in 1979, where he described the theory that in the future we would have no common story or great narrative to agree on. We would have a lot of coexistent truth, and that is a very strong power in Danish pedagogy right now. And the words like common, shared, and general has a new meaning today. When you say that we had to do, it's a common understanding, and that's actually false, because there are no common understandings. And we have some very new relations between research and politics. Earlier on in Denmark, we had these universities, who was placed here and in Copenhagen and in Aarhus and other cities. To put it shortly, where the professors lived their own life and no politicians actually tried to do or say anything about it. There was divided sectors of education and politics. And also in the teacher education, we had, not so many years ago, but we had them recently, another kind of institution called seminarium, similar to where you educate priests in Denmark. And this teacher education was actually a seminarium, which was much more independent from politicians. And but they have been closed and put together to these bigger campuses in order to make these changes. So there's clearly a new relation between research and politics in Denmark, and the politicians invest more in education, both money but also power. They want to control it. They want to make sure that the money that goes into education is used properly. And that's a kind of that's a new development.
So there is a political need for more control over the BA education programs.
expensive, and also the master and PhD programs.
Also the master, any
all the way, and actually also the public schools. And the newest thing is the children's daycare also. They have learning programs for 2 or 3 years old children. So that's I said that you couldn't use common or general, but that is actually a general movement. So to put this shortly, and that was the boring part, it's going to end pretty soon here. We have a very complex ground for the pedagogy of the competitive state, because we have a complex relations between some theory which focus on learning and competences, and the scientific idea that there is no observable truth. That's very postmodern. But we use it to control and instrumentalize our institutions and our learning programs. And we try to provide evidence of how we can take a 2 or 1 year old child and make them to a 25-year-old well-educated person. And we try to make detailed studies of the brain's function and the effect of different programs. And right now we are very interested in a researcher from New Zealand called John Hattie, who has made some big meta-evidence studies of which school programs has the biggest effects. So we have a clear idea of what we want to do with people, but we base it on theories that explains that there is really no truth and there is no true idea. That's a dilemma, a political dilemma, that we are working with a political truth, but we have a theoretical, more complex way of looking at it.
So the dilemma is, how can the politicians be goal-oriented and orient our education towards specific goals, while at the same time recognizing that there are no specificities left. I mean, there are no, you cannot have one goal because there are multiple truths. So that's the political dilemma that you're getting at, yeah?
Yeah, okay. And it's getting even more complex, but I hope you can follow me. So we have a dilemma: how can we instrumentalize and make the education more efficient, and respecting that there is no actual truth and people has to be free. That's the big problem today that we are working on and discussing. So the last really hardcore theoretical idea, and that's a kind of new idea, and I've been publishing some articles about this theoretical development and a book that is about to come out. And the first 2 parts of this model here define some theory. We have the modern period, who started with the Enlightenment in 1690, I would say, with John Locke's publishing, first publishing. And that's the modern period where we had these great political ideas of socialism and liberalism and conservatism, and we had the science of nature and physics, who had made great progress. And we had the industrialization, and we had some great narratives that our way of living was the right one, and we had the political liberalism that every man is born free, and the human rights and everything. These great ideas were created in this period. And the scientific studies was carried out inside these great narratives. And then one can say, that's not true, because we had Adam Smith's liberal economy, capitalism, and we had Karl Marx, socialist economic system. But there is actually no great gap there. There isn't the practical policy, but they are based on the same scientific ideas. And Karl Marx actually studied Adam Smith. So that you can say that all the Enlightenment movement was one great narrative, which carried out several discussions. In the postmodern era, it's an unsolved matter when did postmodernity start, but one of the backgrounds for it was definitely Nietzsche's writings in the late 18th century. But especially after World War II, the postmodern idea showed some great influences in our cultural life, at least. And there we have the theoretical absence of great narrative. There is no truth. One has to define its own truth. And the method there is to especially deconstructing old narratives, deconstructing old ideas, showing how old ideas is false or socially constructed. In Denmark, some of the clearest example of this is the debate on, that's an irritating thing to say in English, but I'll try it, the debate on sex, not actually intercourse, but the genders. Sorry. Yeah, but you can say both. The gender discussion. What is a man? And what is a woman? And what if you're something in between? And is a man a valid category? How should a man be? How should a woman be? And there are many different theories. Some work with 2 genders, and some work with 3, and others have actually 6 genders that they use in theoretical models. That's a great example of how old narrative are deconstructed. Also, in our institution here, we have a great discussion about problem behavior. What is actually problem behavior? In children, in young people, in criminals, how can we understand it that some people act in a way that the surroundings do not accept? Before we had some theories about they were evil and people who did bad things were evil, and we have left that ideas and use more complex models of explaining that, of course. And this last one is actually, as far as I know, and I've heard my own explanation. I have presented it internationally a few times, but I'm pretty sure that the word comes from me. And I call it post-modernity, because we have, especially in Northern Europe, but also in America, a movement away from this postmodern understanding. Because we have a much more strong political construction of a great narrative. And the method of science is more and more an attempt to construct some evidence to support this political narrative. And in Denmark, it's clearly shown that if you want to have an academic career, you have to say the right things in a much more clear way than earlier. And some of you who have lived under a communist regime might recognize some of the elements in this. But we are actually going that way again. There are many empirical examples in Denmark, but our PhD programs early on were much more open. But today you have to research very strategically. And when they call for applicants to the PhD student, half of the programs today are very fixed upon a specific theoretical idea that is actually not consensus in the academic world, but politically designed that we want researchers who think and do this and research in this. That's
the political system buys research to support its own agendas and ideas.
Yeah, and that's really new, because early on we had professors who were recognized by their fellows, but today more and more, if you want to be a professor, you have to think the right way politically. So we have we are constructing a great narrative, but the background theory are still postmodern, but we don't actually accept the consequences of postmodernity anymore. So we are moved to another phase. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad or anything, but I just it's clear to me that we are going this way. And that is actually explanation why we can make these competence-based, performing-based programs using these theories. That's because we are building a new great narrative. And that narrative is, of course, summed up by the idea of the competitive state. And I have to be fast. Yeah. In Denmark and in most of Europe, we have some severe challenges. That is the political background for these demands of more supportive science. We have an aging population, especially in the northern Europe, also in Italy, in France, as I recall. I don't know about Serbia.
Yes.
You look very young, all of you, but you're also aging statistically. Okay. So we can see that's a problem. And in Denmark, we used to stop working about 60, and then we buy a boat and enjoy life. That cannot be done anymore, because most of the people will soon be over 60. So we are raising our retirement age gradually. The same in Serbia, yeah. Yes. And in Greece they have big problems concerning that right now. So we have to do something about it politically. And we also have an increased pressure on public finances. We cannot afford a lot of small institutions. That's why we built new ones, bigger ones. And we had to do something about the amount of work that we put here. For a year ago, we had an agreement on how many classes should we teach and everything, and these things have been cancelled. So now it's our leader here that defines what does he think is appropriate for Jesper to do.
The state just decided that we have to work 20% more for the same wage. So now we're working this year, as of this year, 20% more for the same wage.
Yeah. And that's why in the long term we had to make sure that people like Jesper are educated in a way that he does things efficiently and better. We had some structural consequences of adapting to the global competition, and in Denmark's case it's in Ove Kaj Pedersen, as I presented before, his book. He's a political economist. He claims that when we joined the inner market in 1986 in the European Union, the inner market, we actually, what can you say in English? We were no longer able to define our own economic policies. We could not protect our citizens from the global competition. Early on, when we produced a lot of ships in Denmark, big ships, when, for example, the Koreans produced better or cheaper ships than ours, we just put some custom on it, and then we could keep on producing ships. That's no longer possible. So we have no protection. So we have to adapt to the global competition. And we do that by working more. And right now, if you see a paper with some angry workers, we have a situation with
a strike?
A strike? No, it's a strike.
When you
Danish crown.
Butchers?
What?
Butchers?
Yeah. We have some working conflicts concerning exactly that people has to go down in wages. So we have some consequences that of the global competition that demands us to be more efficient, to be more cheaper, more cheaper, just cheaper. And then we have another non-economic but a cultural issue that we are no longer a well-defined cultural state. We have now a diverse culture with many ethnic groups and many languages due to immigration. And we have to accept that fact too, that some of our institutions must adapt to that. And then we have a general change in the social interaction in society, the divorce rate,